I recently rewatched Roger Martin's YouTube video, A Plan is Not a Strategy, published as part of a quick study series produced by the Harvard Business Review. This video has racked up over 6 million views online, making it probably one of the most watched YouTube videos on strategy of all time. Roger has been recognized as one of the world's leading strategic thinkers and authors in the field of strategy, so his views are certainly worth considering, even if you're not familiar with his work. Whilst Roger touches on his own definition of strategy throughout this video, it's not the main subject that he focuses on. Instead, he uses this video to highlight what he sees as the significant risks faced by organizations which practice the discipline known as strategic planning instead of the discipline which he defines as strategy. These disciplines sound similar and they share some common practices, but there are some fundamental differences, which is what Roger seeks to explain in his video. Given he only has less than 10 minutes in this quick study guide format, Roger only hints at the debate which has raged between those who practice strategic planning on the one hand and those who practice strategy. But this debate has been going on for decades. So an initial question for you is, which side are you on? Does your organization practice strategy or strategic planning, or some combination of both? Or are you still trying to figure out the differences between them? If you're not sure of the differences, that's not surprising. On his blog and in other channels, Roger has shared his related concern that the practice of strategy is becoming a lost art. These debates between the different schools of thought on how best to develop and implement strategy go a long way to explaining why this topic leaves many leaders and managers confused. As I've highlighted in a previous video, if you struggle with strategy, you're not alone. I've studied and practiced the subject for many years, and I've developed a visual model-based strategy framework which helps organizations, their leaders and managers clarify their strategy and improve how they implement it. If you'd like to know more about this framework, then see the link in the first comment below. So, if you're still trying to figure out if you're using the right approach to strategy given the context in your own organization, or if you're not sure that you fully grasped all of Roger's points, then this video is for you. In it, I'll use the following diagram to represent and explain many of Roger's points in a more visual way. This diagram has been adapted from the category maturity lifecycle diagram by the author Geoffrey Moore, which he published in his book Dealing with Darwin. And it provides a general representation of an organization's life cycle, which is why it's useful for us to illustrate Roger's points over it. The vertical axis represents some measure of size of your organization, be it customer numbers, sales, or market share, whatever seems appropriate for your particular market or industry. The horizontal axis represents time, often in years or decades, or it could stretch out even longer. The diagram highlights that organizations typically start from zero on the left-hand side, then go through some period of initial growth, the green S-shaped curve, and then at some point they may level off onto this plateau. The indefinite elastic period is Geoffrey's term to highlight that this section may stretch out over a very long period of time, years, decades, even centuries in some industries, with the occasional dips and recoveries in between. This line is long. We can just fit it onto the diagram by breaking it in half where these two lines are and then concentrating it down. That allows you then to focus on what might happen at the end of the curve. This is where we see the inflection point, which represents that point in time when the organization starts to lose, as Roger describes it. This is often caused by some disruptive change in the external environment, or sometimes just because of poor internal management. That loss may be a downturn, or it may turn into a more permanent decline, from which the organization may or may not recover. Where does your organization currently sit on this life cycle diagram? What does it look like if you put some units on it for size and time? One of the useful things about this general life cycle diagram is that it can be scaled up or down. This diagram can be used to represent your whole organization if it only has one line of business, or it can represent an aggregated view if your business is made up of different lines of business, products, services, or other organizational structures, each at different stages of their own life cycles. For this video, I'll just keep the diagram simple. So your core business, your initial business, will just represent as curve A. And then, to illustrate some of Roger's points, we'll add in a few extra curves. So now I've explained the basic diagram, we can start adding on some of Roger's key points. He starts off his video with a warning that by simply putting the word strategic in front of the word planning has created a discipline which may mislead you into thinking that you've developed a strategy, when all you really have is a plan. This is a situation which Roger calls the strategic planning trap. Through the use of a case study, Roger describes how an organization may only realize that it has fallen into this trap when it begins to fail or falter, by which time it may be too late to turn that situation around. We can therefore just represent where the strategic planning trap is on this diagram, which will be somewhere over here. So the trap is sprung after an inflection point. At the end of the video, Roger emphasizes the risks of relying solely on strategic planning when he states that if you have a plan, you will fail. But did his argument convince you that if you don't practice strategy, your organization will fail? If not, would you be more open to considering the possibility of failure if we add in the phrase "at some point in the future" at the end of his statement? You see, Roger is not claiming that failure is imminent, and the reasons why your organization may fail in the future may not yet be evident, particularly if you're in an organization or industry which has historically been quite stable over time. However, there are plenty of case studies in the strategy literature which describe how previously stable industries and leading organizations have been disrupted in the past. The question then becomes not if, but when and why an inflection point may occur that leads to your future failure. So, if you were to mark up your version of the diagram with inflection points, where would they be relative to where you are today on your life cycle curve? Do you have any sense of what might cause an inflection point? Are there things going on in the world which concern you when it relates to your own organization? Now, if your organization is still on the S-curve, you should still do this exercise. I've been involved in growth companies where they had their initial growth stage disrupted by a new wave of technology washing over them before they'd fully grown. In his video, Roger uses the case study based on Southwest Airlines, which is a useful choice since Southwest represents what is often called a new entrant type of disruptive threat to the existing airline industry. At the same time, Southwest also represented what is called a substitute type of disruptive threat to the intercity bus industry, and its leading player, Greyhound. But it's this risk of disruption and his view that strategic planning will not help you identify or mitigate such risks in advance, which Roger is referring to when he says, "The tricky thing about planning is that whilst you are planning, chances are at least one of your competitors is figuring out how to win." The practice of strategy, however, includes a range of tools and frameworks which can help you identify potential disruptions and inflection points, and so can buy you time to develop options for how you might respond. Using the life cycle diagram for context, we can explore when and why organizations might practice either strategy or strategic planning. One pattern that I've seen in many organizations is that startups and scale-ups over on the S-curve begin by practicing some form of strategy. Then, at some point near the top of their growth curve, organizations tend to transition over to practicing strategic planning as they settle into a life on the plateau. Have you experienced this pattern before, or have you seen a different version of it? In this part of the diagram, where I add the labels data and forecast, I'm highlighting that strategic planning has an underlying assumption that the future will be much like the past, which tends to lead to a narrow forecasting funnel of what the future might actually look like based on your historical data. The risk that I'm highlighting here is that strategic planning does not usually use tools which would help you spot an impending inflection point, for which little or no data may exist ahead of time. Strategy, on the other hand, takes a more open and inquiring look at the future, both the opportunities and the threats, and doesn't assume that the past is necessarily a good indication of what will happen in the future. So why do organizations transition from practicing strategy to strategic planning? One possible reason touched on by Roger is due to the difference between what he terms managers and leaders, to which I'd also add the term entrepreneurs, which we can show now on this diagram. Roger makes the point that practicing strategy involves a higher degree of uncertainty than strategic planning. He explains that uncertainty can lead to a great deal of angst in managers who are not used to dealing with it, and who may therefore prefer the greater sense of certainty and control offered by the practice of strategic planning. He also highlights that managers are traditionally encouraged and incentivized to be right and not make mistakes, which also tends to make them less risk-averse. Those who are prepared to take risks and deal with uncertainty, the entrepreneurs and the growth leaders, often move on or take a back seat once an organization begins to mature. Often they're replaced by career managers, which is when the change in approach to strategy may occur. That's why you also sometimes see original founders return when an organization subsequently gets into trouble, as they seek to rediscover their earlier growth magic. So which role do you see yourself as? Do these characterizations or expectations and resulting behavior ring true? I've acted in all three roles in large corporate clients, so I've seen the challenges that each role faces firsthand when working with colleagues playing different roles. Roger is not saying that managers cannot learn to practice strategy. He just highlights that to do so, you must become more adept at dealing with the risk and uncertainty that it entails. There are a number of different strategy tools and frameworks, including Roger's own knowledge funnel, which he writes about in his book, The Design of Business, which I've found useful in helping managers seek ways to better cope with uncertainty and risk. I've also included all of those tools and frameworks in my own model-based strategy framework. So now we can use this diagram to highlight what I'll call different types of strategy gap, which is the areas where strategy may not be practiced once an organization has moved over to strategic planning. The first strategy gap is the one that covers identifying inflection points, which we've already touched on. So you're looking for disruptions or changes in the wider macroeconomic environment, which may cause some significant change in the way that your company can operate. Next, there may be a strategy gap here on the diagram. If your organization has shifted to strategic planning, but then decides it wants to seek out some new growth, represented here with curve B. What approach to strategy will be used here if management of curve A is already using strategic planning? The risk is that that's not a question that is considered, and your organization just defaults to using what it currently uses, i.e. strategic planning, instead of questioning whether it would be better to develop a new strategy from first principles for this new growth initiative. My own experience is that new growth initiatives developed using a strategic planning approach often stumbled and failed in the early stages, only after a lot of money had been poured in. However, the blame for such failures was rarely pinned on the strategy discipline used. The blame was instead placed on a range of other factors, either poor market conditions or poor execution. So the organizations involved did not necessarily learn from their mistakes, particularly if they demoted or fired those involved. Now, what if curve B is not yours, but one of your competitors? The strategy gap may explain why organizations miss or don't recognize major new opportunities in the market, which can result in a weakening of the competitive position over time, if you miss that next wave. What if you do foresee or spot an inflection point emerging? Well, curves C and D represent your response to a disruptive threat. But the risk is if you develop these options too late to replace your disruptive core business as it starts to decline. Geoffrey Moore has written quite a few books which cover this gap, along with a number of other authors. So, to wrap up, do the concepts now marked up on these diagrams help clarify the risk that Roger makes when he states that a plan is not a strategy, and if you plan, you will fail? Do these diagrams lead to any new insights or raise some useful new questions for you? If so, please let me know in the comments below.